Welcome to the fourth and final installment of Atheist Debates presents Debate Review, Matt Dillahunty versus Sye Ten Bruggencate from May 2014. This is part 4, the final cross-examination. Beginning roughly where we left off in part 3, there are just a few more moments in the cross-examination that I'd like to address, followed by 1 or 2 moments from the audience questions, and then just a brief couple of notes about the closing remarks from each of us in order to kind of wrap up the problems with the presuppositionalist position and Sye's in particular. Sye begins with this presupposition that God exists. It's his starting point. It's a position that he holds is true, and that he's absolutely certain of this because God is capable of making him absolutely certain. And that's a bit confusing, because if you're going to presuppose something, the justification for presupposing it is that it cannot be independently verified. And so he's in this position where he presupposes God, and then because he's presupposed God, God can then make him absolutely certain that his presupposition is not only justified, but true. And on several occasions I asked, how is it that God can reveal something to you such that you can be absolutely certain? After all, you're a flawed individual, as are we all, I suppose. And his answer is nothing more than, well, God can do that because he's God. There's no explanation there. It's just yet another assertion in this circular justification. He extends this to positions that he feels are directly derived from that initial presupposition. And here's an example.
You've said that you believe that we all already know God exists.
That's right.
And you're convinced that this is true.
It's not whether I'm convinced or not. It is true.
Okay. And it's absolutely impossible for you to be wrong about that.
About that, yes.
Okay.
So here, rather than claiming that he believes something to be true and offering some reasonable justification for it, he just asserts that it is in fact true. It doesn't matter whether he's convinced of it, it's just the truth, and that he's absolutely certain about this and cannot be wrong. The question I asked wasn't about the logical absolutes or about his presupposition directly. I asked about his position that we all already know that God exists. This position is actually the result of a specific interpretation of a passage in the Bible. So what he's done is he's essentially started with a presupposition that God exists, used that presupposed God as a foundation for the presupposition, used that God as a foundation for absolute certainty about positions that are derived from that presupposition, and then he includes his belief that the Bible is entirely true in this derivation, and then extends the certainty to cover his interpretation of a particular passage in the Bible. He's basically set himself up so that among the things that he cannot be wrong about include his personal interpretation of Bible passages. And all of this is backed up by the mechanism that he's never demonstrated by which a God can make him absolutely certain and reveal truth to him. Continuing on from that assertion of his that we all know that God exists, I asked him this.
So what about the Paraha, the tribe that has no God concept, who has no, well, they didn't have numbers and any other things, but they didn't have any God concept. And when the missionaries went down there, they were baffled by this, that they had no appeal to super.
That's a great question, because if I ask people in this audience, you say, you have no God concept either. Why did Christians send missionaries to them, though? You see, because if they did not know,
that this
hang
has
on,
anything to,
if
no,
they
no,
didn't
it's
know,
my time for questions.
Okay.
And if you get derailed, I want to know, what about the Paraha?
what about them? They know that God exists.
Even though they have no concept, no language, no nothing.
I deny
and
that.
when presented with the concept.
I deny that. That's why we send missionaries, because if they didn't know that God exists, sending missionaries would be the worst thing we could do.
So
we send missionaries.
You deny what the sociologists who went down there, who studied them and reported back, have to say.
Exactly.
Okay, fine.
So here he starts by saying it's a great question and suggests that he could find people in the audience who could claim to have no God concept, demonstrating that he doesn't understand this subject. Those of us in the audience have many different God concepts. We've been presented with Jehovah, Allah, Ra, Zeus, and countless others. We frequently discuss these God concepts. It's part of our culture. Now, whether or not we have the same specific God concept is irrelevant. We have a God concept and a variety of God concepts. We just don't believe that they exist. The Paraha had no concept of God within their culture or their language until we arrived and presented it to them. And to understand this more clearly, imagine that the Paraha had no concept of fairies. They had no word for it, no concept, and no recognition of a concept. Sye's response here is roughly the equivalent of saying that he could find people in the audience who don't have a concept of fairies. That's pretty unlikely and completely misses the point. He's claiming that everyone knows that God, or fairies in this example, exist. And yet, when presented with people who clearly, by all accounts and all supporting evidence, have no concept of God or fairies, he begins by demonstrating his confusion by equating no concept with does not believe, yet another equivocation fallacy on his part. He then denies the evidence that they have no God concept and claims that's why we send missionaries, because if they didn't know God exists, sending missionaries would be the worst thing we could do. This is a clear demonstration of Sye's muddled thinking. If these people have no concept of God, then sending missionaries, according to Sye, would be the worst thing they could do, basically because you're introducing now a concept and then damning them if they reject it. However, we reject the evidence that they didn't have a concept of God, or he rejects this evidence. And his rejection of this is based purely on his confidence that he cannot be wrong on this subject. But what if he is wrong? And what if it's the case that the missionaries, what they're doing, is actually the worst thing they could do? That possibility is summarily rejected because Sye is convinced that he cannot be wrong. This constant overconfidence is the key thing that ensures that Sye and those who agree with him simply cannot and do not debate. They just preach, and they reject evidence that doesn't fit their presuppositions. In my case, when I talked about what I do presuppose, and that this is a matter of necessity because I can't demonstrate it, if evidence were to come along that contradicted my presuppositions, I would have to then evaluate it. This is the whole point of not asserting absolute certainty or proclaiming to know absolute truth and the absolutes about reality and all of this other nonsense. Because as soon as you do, you have closed the door to any possible investigation, any rational discourse about the subject. And all you can then do is assert, assert, assert. He's going to compound this problem by rejecting the evidence about how brains develop a theory of mind, by claiming that infants know that God exists.
What about babies?
What about them?
Do they know that God exists?
Yes, they do.
How can that be the case when we know that babies develop a theory of mind over time? How is it possible that they can know that God exists when they cannot, and there's no demonstration that they can be aware that there are other minds until some period of time has passed?
Well, you're telling me something you know now. Is this what you believe, or is it what you know?
What difference does it make? I asked a question.
Well, you believe it. You believe that that's the case. I don't believe that that's the case.
I believe that that's the case because that's where the evidence points.
Evidence presupposes truth. Truth presupposes God.
Okay.
Notice that when presented with this question about babies and brains, he immediately ignores the question and tries to deflect. Instead of answering the question and acknowledging that he's rejecting evidence that contradicts his position, he instead tries to attack my position. When I note that my position is based on evidence, instead of addressing that evidence, he just deflects again by saying, evidence presupposes truth, truth presupposes God, implying that because I can't be absolutely certain about the evidence, or that because my definition of truth is different from his, even though he's tentatively accepted that for the sake of this argument, he can then reject this position, reject all of the evidence that conflicts with his, and assert that he's absolutely certain that babies know that God exists without presenting a sound argument or evidence for his position. With his position that we all know that God exists, I wanted to ask how it can be possible for us to know something and yet not be aware that we know this something.
God makes it so that we all know he exists.
Right.
What do you mean by know? Do you mean just that we're aware of that God exists, or that we...
You have sufficient knowledge of God for your condemnation. Okay. Everyone. That's why we send missionaries.
How can someone know something and yet not be aware of it?
Well, I say they are aware of it, but they suppress the truth and unrighteousness, as this is in
Well, if you
Romans 1.
suppress it, then... Well, how is it that somebody could know that God exists and be aware of it, and yet be convinced that they not only do they not know it, but they don't believe it?
Well, it depends to the degree that they suppress it, because God hands them over to it. Because I went to the Atheistic Reason Rally a couple years back, and the guys, high school age, college age, I could reason with them. The guys that were 40, 50 with their tight ponytail, the greasy ponytail coming out to me, they were just giving me the finger. They wouldn't talk to me. God hands them over to it. Are they more convinced that there is no God? I don't doubt it.
You have sufficient knowledge of God for your condemnation. This doesn't answer the question at all. It doesn't provide us any useful information. Perhaps it's the case that no awareness of God is considered sufficient by God to condemn us. There's no quantification of knowledge and no response to how much knowledge would be sufficient. But on the subject of awareness, he says that we are aware of our knowledge of God, but that we suppress it. And I'd argue that this is a contradiction. Claiming that I am simultaneously aware of something and that I've suppressed it to the point where I'm not aware that I'm aware sets up a contradiction. Meanwhile, he's now claiming that we're lying about our awareness of God, all predicated on his conviction that he cannot be wrong. And while it might be a low blow, I find it very telling that he claims to be able to reason with the younger folks and then clearly expresses his exasperation and disdain for the greasy ponytailed older folks. One might argue that the truth here is that he can argue with people who don't have a solid understanding of arguments, fallacies, and epistemology, and he cannot argue with the people who do. Continuing on with the subject of God revealing the truth that he exists to everyone, I asked the following.
Why would, if God can reveal the truth that he exists to everybody, why would he leave the most important message? I'm assuming that the gospel message is more important. I mean, it's the gateway to salvation, supposedly. Why would he leave the most important message prone to mistakes from poor apologists, scribal errors, and the limitations of reason, rather than directly revealing that to everyone?
For a reason which is perfectly sufficient for God.
This is a completely vapid response that echoes his answer from the previous video that God can do something because he's God. Essentially, his answer is, I don't know why God did it, but God has a reason, and that's good enough for him and me. And this is a non-answer that can be used for anything at any time. It doesn't add to our understanding, and it doesn't do anything to support his position. It just demonstrates how vapid his position is. Continuing on with this line of questioning, Sye affirms that not only do we all know that God exists, but that we're all absolutely certain of this.
So you believe that God reveals to all of us in ways that we can all be certain?
Everyone is certain. Not can be certain, is certain.
Okay.
That's why they're without excuse.
Why wouldn't...
Now that he's presented his assertion that we're all certain, and his confidence in this is based on the revelation that God has given him, I wanted to ask how to resolve the problem of competing, contradictory revelations.
Okay.
That's why they're without excuse.
Why wouldn't that mean that God revealed to me the fallacies in your argument and the objections to your position, which would raise a contradiction?
Well, because fallacies assume that God has revealed himself to you, because you appeal to logical absolutes which you can't make sense of without God.
That's what you say, but that's not what I say.
Well, the thing is, you can't know you're not a brain in a vat. You've seen that.
I didn't
you
say
said
that.
Yes, you did. I have video of you
I said
saying
I
that.
can't
You said-
demonstrate.
You said you
So to quickly clarify the brain in a bat distraction, which is what this is, he continually mischaracterizes my position. It's not that I'm claiming that I can't know that I'm not a brain in a vat in some absolute sense. It's that I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. No one has demonstrated a way for me to verify either way, and there's no reason for me to suppose that that's the case. And we'll talk a little bit more about burden of proof later in the debate. But the purpose of my question here and the follow-up question is to expose the potential problems of conflicting claims of revelation. Sye once again ignores the question and tries to expose a problem with my position rather than demonstrating the efficacy of his. He's done this several times. But if I'm wrong, if my position is completely wrong, that doesn't mean that his position is right. And I need to expose that this is what he is repeatedly implying when instead of offering his answer to a question, he merely tries to show that I'm wrong. And knowing that I needed to expose this, I asked the following question.
If something hasn't been demonstrated to be impossible, is it then possible?
No. Well, it hasn't demonstrated to be impossible?
If you haven't demonstrated that it's impossible, does that mean that it's possible?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Okay.
So here I'm laying a trap that's designed to expose the fallacy that he's repeatedly engaged in. There's nothing dishonest about the trap or about laying this trap. The entire purpose is to find a foundational point on which we agree and then show that his claims conflict with that foundational principle. If X has not been shown to be false, then that does not mean that X is true. Similarly, if X has not been shown to be true, that doesn't mean that X is false. Sye agrees. And yet he repeatedly avoids giving his answer to my question while choosing instead to attack my position, or his version of my position in some cases, with the implication being that if mine is wrong, his must be right. Before I set off the trap, I wanted to see if I could get him to agree with this methodology of finding a foundational point on which two people agree, starting from there to reach the point of divergence where they begin to disagree so that you can analyze that.
When you're trying to convince someone of something about which you disagree, isn't it wise to start where you do agree and work from there?
I would say in many situations, but Jesus Christ said there is no neutrality. You're either for me or against me. There is no neutrality in this instance. If I assume neutrality, I'm denying what Scripture says.
So if we're going to go about trying to be reasonable, why isn't what you just said a case of special pleading?
Because this is about something that Scripture has revealed that all of you know. And if I go to a neutral position, I say, well, let's put God on the shelf. Let's see if we can argue to the existence of God. I'm denying what Scripture says. It says, do not answer the fool according to his folly, lest you be like him.
But that doesn't answer my question of
Sure
why
it does.
that's not special pleading. All you did was demonstrate that it is special pleading.
What's wrong with special pleading in your worldviews?
It's a fallacy.
It's a logical fallacy?
Yes.
Do you believe that, or is that true?
I believe it.
But it's not necessarily true, right?
Well, it's true in the sense of my definition of being consistent with reality. In reality, it's a fallacy.
Which reality? Yours or mine?
Well, it seems to be the one we agree on. Don't you think it's a fallacy?
I have not. I missed the meeting, Matt. When did we agree on that reality?
I'm asking you now.
I have a reality where God exists. When was the meeting?
I'm not evidently in that reality, but I'm asking you now. Don't
You are
you
in that
believe
reality.
that that's a fallacy?
I can account for logical fallacies. I'm
It
asking how
doesn't
you
matter
account
whether
for
you think you can account for logical fallacies. Don't you believe that that's a
No, I
fallacy?
don't.
Okay. If you don't believe it's a fallacy, why is special pleading not a fallacy? And why is it considered to be a fallacy by every expert?
Well, the thing is that according to my reality or according to your reality?
Take your pick.
According to my reality,
answer.
according to my reality, it's not special pleading.
Well, that's not my question. According to your reality, is special pleading a fallacy?
Yes, it can be.
You just said you believed that you didn't believe that it
is.
was.
Well, I don't believe that what you said was special pleading.
No, I asked
I believe.
you
Okay,
if
yes,
special
it's a
pleading is
fallacy. I believe it's a fallacy.
So
yes.
now we spent all this time to get to the point that what we really disagree on is whether what you said is special pleading.
Right.
And by definition, I'd say that special pleading is when you say that we're going to use reason and the standards of reason in every case, but this one is special because it's God.
No, that's not. That's a different situation.
Time.
Okay.
See, because everyone knows that God exists.
Time's up.
That's time.
Here, rather than simply agreeing that we should work from where we agree in order to examine why we disagree further down the line of reasoning, he instead claims that while this might be true in some cases, it's not true about claims about God, because Jesus doesn't allow for neutrality. And that's a curious objection, because first of all, my question was about how we should discuss disagreements in general, and his answer is that on this specific topic, that's not an option. And when I ask why his exemption here isn't a case of special pleading, his answers are because this is about what we all already know, a position he asserts but doesn't demonstrate, and because this is about denying Scripture, conflicting with his assertion that Scripture is true. As I noted, he engaged in special pleading, and when asked to explain why it wasn't special pleading, he gave two reasons which further defined his case as one of special pleading. And when pressed on this, he once again deflects, refusing to offer a defense and instead asking me what's wrong with special pleading in your worldview. In order to avoid acknowledging that he's engaged in special pleading, he then questions whether it's a fallacy, whether it's true that it's a fallacy according to whose reality. All of this is a big red herring. And when pressed on his position, on whether his position is fallacious, he says, I can account for logical fallacies, which doesn't address the question at all. I don't care if you can account for fallacies. I'm asking whether this was a fallacy. And when pressed on that, he goes back to whose version of reality, and then says that special pleading is in fact a fallacy, but that what he stated is not an example of special pleading. Great, we wasted a whole bunch of time on a lengthy tap dance that avoided the question. But the truth is exposed at the end. I gave a definition of special pleading and asked how his position was different from that, and why it didn't qualify as special pleading. And his response was to just claim that it was a different situation because everyone knows that God exists, thus confirming that it is in fact special pleading, but trying to justify it. In truth, he's engaged in special pleading and feels justified in this because he's convinced that he can't be wrong. In the past, he and others have referred to this as virtuously circular. But let's take a look at one of my mistakes.
Fallacies, even in you've said too that argument from authority is a logical fallacy. I admit that. However, it's not always a logical fallacy, because you have said that yourself. It's not a fallacy if you're appealing to the actual authority.
Yes.
Right. So there are instances when something is a logical fallacy and sometimes it isn't. Is that special pleading?
Well, those aren't the same things.
Is it special pleading to say that an argument from authority is sometimes a fallacy and sometimes it's not a fallacy?
Argument from authority is always a fallacy. The fallacy is defined as appealing to an authority that is not an authority.
So when you appeal to authority, then it's not an argument from...
If you simply cite an authority, that's not necessarily an appeal to authority fallacy. The name of the fallacy is appeal to authority. The definition of the fallacy is appealing to an authority who is not an authority.
And who gets to determine whether...
So that's not the definition of argument from authority fallacy. That's the definition for argument from insufficient or inappropriate authority. The argument from authority fallacy is when something is claimed to be true because a particular authority says that it's true. I think what happened here is that I saw where he was going and wanted to clarify, but didn't immediately recognize the confusion over the label for the fallacy. He was confusing the two fallacies, and my brain decided to skip right over the incorrect label and dive into the explanation of the core of what he was confused about. When is an appeal to an authority considered fallacious? So, for clarity, the argument from authority fallacy describes a situation where someone is asserting that something is true because an authority has said so. It's true that I'm a diabetic because my doctor told me would be an example of the fallacy. I may, in fact, be a diabetic. My doctor could be correct. But the reason that I'm a diabetic and the reason that I have justification in believing that I am is not merely due to a doctor telling me. It's based on the evidential facts that support that diagnosis. Meanwhile, the argument from inappropriate or insufficient authority describes a situation where one cites someone who isn't an authority. It's sort of a subcategory of the argument from authority fallacy. It's true that I'm diabetic because 8 out of 10 NBA players have told me that I am, would be an example of that fallacy. The confusion here is that we do cite authorities, people who are experts in a field, but what we're really citing is their expertise in evaluating the evidence in order to reach a tentative, probabilistic conclusion. We're not making proclamations about truth. It's a necessity because we can't all be experts on everything, and we don't always have time to evaluate all of the evidence. It's a fallacy because we're prone to mistakes, like the one I made when addressing this.
What you do is you present the credentials and you demonstrate that the person, first of all, exists, and then you demonstrate that they are actually an expert in the field.
So I included this little jab for one reason. When explaining the problems of citing authorities, I needed to make it very clear that we cite authorities for good reasons, and that what Sye was trying to do was cite an authority that he couldn't even demonstrate to be real.
What's the evidence of that?
Well, the position is actually that we cannot yet demonstrate supernatural causation.
And what's your
evidence is that we have not yet.
That's an argument from ignorance.
No, it's not, because
Sure it
I'm
is.
not asserting that it's necessarily impossible for us to ever, which is why I put maybe in what I was talking about, that maybe it's the case that we'll never be able to demonstrate supernatural causation. All we can say is that so far, no one has demonstrated that it is possible to demonstrate.
Now, is that true, or do you just believe that?
Both.
So Sye wanted to take me to task for my position that we currently have no identifiable mechanism for confirming supernatural causation. This topic has come up a lot lately, and I'll address it in full in another video. But the thing to notice here is that after getting an answer to his question, he doesn't bother to address the actual answer. Instead, he once again tries to challenge the answer by challenging the foundations of my position. He's going to continue this sort of attack by once again misrepresenting my position as that of someone who doesn't claim to know anything, because he wants to shift from my definition of no, which doesn't require absolute certainty, to his definition of no, which does require absolute certainty.
It's absolutely absurd to engage with somebody who wants to have a debate about truth, and you ask him how he knows something to be true, and he says, well, I don't claim to know anything to be true. It's absurd.
Why is it absurd to recognize honestly the limitations of that which has not yet been proved?
Because every word out of your mouth betrays your position. Because here's my question, Matt. You're about to utter sounds into the ether. You're about to formulate words, and you're about to speak them out here. On what basis do you assume that those words mean the same thing they did 5 seconds ago?
What makes you think I'm going to utter sounds into the ether?
You just did.
How do you know?
I just heard you.
How do you know?
Well, my question is my turn to ask questions.
So I asked, why is it absurd to recognize the limitations of knowledge? This seems to be reasonable. This is the foundation of skepticism. And Sye's response was, because every word out of your mouth betrays your position. And his point is that because I can't give an account for reason and reality and the other presuppositions that I make, and because he thinks he can, that everything I say is borrowing or based on his worldview, which he sees as me being in conflict. But it's only in conflict if you begin with the particular presuppositions that he begins with. And he has offered no justification for why he should begin with those presuppositions, and how he's justified them as a foundation for the things that I presuppose. And I needed a way to demonstrate clearly that he was avoiding any demonstration that his worldview was the only one which could account for this. And it seemed that one of the best options was to turn his standard "how do you know" tactic right back on him. He's the one who claims that he can account for these things, yet he won't actually offer a demonstration of it. And this exposes, fairly clearly I hope, the ridiculous position of just repeatedly asserting that you are certain without providing the justification, and attacking everybody else around you as, oh, you're uncertain, you can't account for this. Well, we could sit there all day saying, you can't account for this, and you can't account for this, and back and forth, and we get nowhere. So from there, we moved on to the problem of induction.
So the future will be like the past, because the future's been like the past in the past.
Well, yes, as long as you're not claiming
That's a logical fallacy.
No, it's not, because I'm not asserting that there is absolutely no difference in the future. I'm saying that my position is that I believe, and I believe that I am rationally justified in believing, that the future is going to be pretty much like the past.
So if I said to you, you've just proven I'm never going to die because I've never died in the past, would that not be a logical fallacy?
No, because we know that people die.
Yeah, but you know what? I'm a lot like those other people except for one thing. I've never died.
And that's true for everybody right up until the point they have.
So, therefore...
So this constant parade of equivocations needed to be exposed. Sye is attempting to construct a syllogism on the fly that demonstrates the problem of induction. This is particularly sad because he's not only misunderstood the problem of induction, namely that it's probabilistic instead of absolute, but he's misunderstood how to construct a valid and sound syllogism. By engaging in yet another bit of cherry-picking that tries to claim that I haven't died yet proves that he won't die. He's trying to demonstrate that this is absurd because we all know he's going to die. He's appealing, in that case, only to select information from the past rather than all relevant information from the past. So he's not exposing the problem of induction. He's just exposing that he can't construct a fallacy, that he's cherry-picking the evidence in order to create flawed premises in a deductive argument. And from there, I tried to get him to respond about the burden of proof.
There is in any situation this establishment of the burden of proof, that you do not believe something until such time as it's been demonstrated to be true or likely true. Do you accept that?
Well, here's the problem, Matt. When you say there's a burden of proof, you're assuming that solipsism has been solved.
No, I'm not.
Sure you are.
Because
is it true that I have a burden of proof? Or do you just believe it?
That is irrelevant. You see, the thing is that you seem to only be able to see this from your worldview. You cannot.
Of course.
You cannot,
so do you.
No, I can put on your worldview hypothetically in order to address something. You seem incapable of putting on mine for a moment to address something. And what I've said from the very beginning, and I could go back and read it, is I defined what I meant by truth. I acknowledge the presuppositions, and that what I mean by truth is that which conforms with reality, which is predicated on the foundation of the logical absolutes. And so when I say I believe something or I know something, that is, the logical absolutes are the foundation upon which it rests.
But you can't account for logical absolutes. That's a problem.
And you keep coming back, as you just did, with you can't account for logical absolutes.
Right.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but neither can you. All you can do is claim that you can account for the logical absolutes. Please account for the logical absolutes.
That is the tu quoque fallacy, tu quoque, to say, I can't, but either can you.
No.
I'm asking how you account for them. How do I account for them?
It would be a fallacy.
I'll be happy to.
It would be a fallacy.
Too is a tu quoque fallacy.
It would be a fallacy if I was asserting that you were wrong. I'm asking you, yes, I'm asking you to demonstrate that you are right.
The thing is, you're saying that I can't account for logical absolutes, but either can you.
No,
that's a
you are asserting that no one but you can account. No one can count for logical absolutes except for within your worldview, and I'm asking you to demonstrate that that's true.
Well, I have no problem doing that. Logical absolutes reflect the thinking of God. What? They reflect the thinking of God.
I'm done with my questions. We can go to the audience.
So when pressed once again to give his account for the logical absolutes, He accuses me of committing the Tuco-K fallacy. I didn't, though I understand why he got confused. If Sye had said, you just committed a fallacy, and I tried to avoid acknowledging my own fallacy by saying, you just committed one too, that'd be an example of the Tuco-K fallacy. If I had claimed that his argument was invalid because he was acting in a way that was inconsistent with his argument, that'd also be an example. In reality, Sye is claiming that his worldview, and only his worldview, can account for the logical absolutes. My position is that I cannot give an account for them, and that those who claim they can give an account for them have failed to give an account. Now, I did say, you can't either, which is an assertion which I would then need to actually demonstrate. But that's a bit of taunting, because he's sitting there in this debate, claiming that he can do something, and that he repeatedly refuses to do every time he's given the opportunity, which is to demonstrate his position. So saying you can't either is just a recognition that you've been asked this question over and over again. You claim to be able to do something. It's like he could walk in and claim that he could fly, and every time we ask him to prove it, he ducks out of it. And then I'm going to say, well, you can't fly. It's not an actual assertion that this is the case and the truth. It's a recognition that he hasn't done it. Let's take a look at a couple of moments from the audience Q&A, starting with a statement that Sye actually got correct with respect to it being a logical argument. And yet some atheists mocked him for it, thinking he'd gotten it entirely wrong.
If you want me to go through that refutation, I'll be happy to. What does the Quran say about the Bible?
That's my question to you.
What does the Quran say about the Bible? Do you have any idea?
Okay.
It says it's a previous revelation of God, and it says that it's true. It says to believe it. And I'll ask the Muslim, why do you not believe the Bible today? And you know what the Muslim will say? Because it's been corrupted. And then I'll ask the Muslim, what does your Quran say about whether the words of Allah can be corrupted? And I'll say, it cannot. See, that's the problem. If the Quran is true, the Bible is true. And because the Bible is true, the Quran is false.
What Sye has presented here is a fairly standard reductio ad absurdum argument. If X implies that Y is true and Y implies that X is false, then X cannot be true. There are still some problems with his position, but logically it's a common and properly constructed argument. The problems with his position are that it depends on very specific interpretations of the Quran, so he'd need to get the Muslim to agree with that particular interpretation, and they can have that argument between them. I've said many times, if you want to know what's wrong with Christianity, you can ask a Jew. If you want to know what's wrong with Judaism, you can ask a Muslim. Atheists haven't actually had to do a whole lot of work here. We just go around and farm up everybody else's objections to all the other religions, and we say, yep, you're all right. The other problem with this position is that it doesn't in any way prove that the Bible is true, and I think this is what confused people. Sye never claimed that this argument proves that the Bible is true. He's merely exposing a problem with an interpretation of the Quran. That if the Quran says the Bible is true, and the Bible then implies that the Quran is false, then the Quran cannot be true. It doesn't tell you anything at all about whether or not the Bible is actually true. The reductio ad absurdum is solely designed to demonstrate a conflict that results in confirmation that a particular premise cannot be true, because if it were true, that would directly lead to it being false. I hope that people understand this better, because the atheists who mocked this made little internet memes out of it, as if it were flawed reasoning. We're mocking one of the only logical arguments that Sye actually presented, and presented in a properly constructed manner. Moving on to the closing statements from this debate, Sye is going to avoid making his case yet again, and instead repeat his objections to my position, or lack of a position, while preaching about Jesus' sacrifice.
He paid that price by dying on a Roman cross, a bloody death, a painful, horrible death. And that is offered here tonight. See, that's your offer. That's the offer. Jesus Christ or absurdity. But you'll probably walk out of here choosing absurdity because you love your sin. But you know what? Your conscience is on my side. You all know that God exists. I urge you, repent. Put your trust in Jesus Christ before it's too late, because you will not like your eternity in hell. I urge you. And I do this as a friend. Like I say, it's too bad that these debates have to happen like this, because I would like to clear up a lot of misconceptions. I'd like to do it in a more friendly tone. But the problem is Matt is up here blaspheming God. Because when you say you don't know that God exists, you're calling God a liar.
So his closing is Jesus Christ or absurdity. The real secret here is that he hasn't demonstrated that his position with respect to Jesus Christ isn't actually absurd. When you say that you don't know that God exists, you're calling God a liar, he says. Well, if there is a God and he claims that I know that he exists when I don't, then he is a liar or mistaken. Can God be mistaken? Can God be a liar? In this case, though, I'm not actively calling God a liar or even saying that the God concept is in fact a lie. I'm simply saying that I don't believe, that I see no reason to believe, and that the people making claims about God haven't met their burden of proof. I'm going to finish by posting my closing in full, because some people seem to have missed the part where I noted that I don't see any reason to ever debate Sye or presuppositionalists ever again. They don't debate, and I don't see any reason to waste any more time on these debates with these particular types of arguments. But this has been a really fun exercise going back through this debate. I know this has been incredibly frustrating for a lot of people. I lived it, and then I watched it several times, and then I had to watch it again and analyze it in order to put these together. And I had to break it up because it was kind of difficult to go through this over and over and over again because there's so many frustrating elements from this. Mistakes were made on both sides, and I hope we learned from them. But the nutshell is this. I don't have an account for the logical absolutes, and I'm not aware of any position that can actually account for them. Sye claims that his worldview can account for them, and he also claims that no other worldview can. That's two separate claims, and he failed to demonstrate either of those points. The second point may be impossible to demonstrate because it would require you to be aware of and expose every possible worldview. When asked to justify his position, he continually deflects. Usually, he restates his objection that I can't account for the absolutes, something I've acknowledged all along from my opening through the entire debate, giving us answers like, for reasons that are perfectly sufficient for God, and God can do that because he's God. And then, when challenged on certain things from members of the audience, he would say, I won't do Bible studies with professed atheists. And these are people who are saying, let me try to adopt your worldview for a second and point out a conflict. Exactly the same thing that he was doing with his reductio ad absurdum with respect to the Quran and the Bible. But he won't adopt any responsibility to explain his position to non-believers because that puts them in the position of being the judge of God. Well, we're in that position, whether he likes it or not. We're judging every claim, every God claim, every claim about reality, and we're trying to find out if there's sufficient reason to believe them, because we'd like to believe them if they're true, and if they're not true, we should avoid believing them, because what you believe impacts other decisions you're going to make and other things that you're going to believe or not. So far, I haven't found any reason to believe. Here's my closing remarks from that debate.
When I said in the clip that I couldn't imagine anyone who tried harder than I did, and then there's another clip where I talk about God being inferior, there's a before and after there. I changed my mind. When I was a Christian, I believed and I loved God, and I was willing to dedicate my life to presenting the truth of Jesus to everyone. I changed my mind. That happens. It's not the only clip, by the way, that misrepresents the order of things or stops short of clarity, but I'm fine with what he presented. After all, I got to speak way more than he did. When you say that my wife is a prostitute, I'm going to ask you for evidence, because that's what my worldview is based on. I'm not going to get irate. I'm not going to tell you better watch it.
Your wife will.
No, actually, my wife won't. And if you'd stop pretending to know my wife while I'm in my closing, when you clearly don't, how do you know my wife's not a prostitute?
Let me give you evidence she's not a prostitute.
How do you know my wife's not a Never mind, this is my closing. He says you can follow me to hell. Well, I'm telling you, apart from Twitter and Facebook, don't follow me. Follow reason, follow the evidence, follow it wherever it leads. Don't make any heroes. I'm nothing special. I'm just somebody who spent some time studying, and I'm up here talking about it. Presuppositionalists don't debate. They claim to have solved the biggest problems in philosophy while asserting that they cannot possibly be wrong and that no other worldview can do this, but they don't demonstrate the truth of the claim that no other worldview can do this. They shift the burden of proof and want you to prove that you can, when what we're really saying is that we don't have evidence that anybody can, including you. They have no interest in demonstrating that belief in God is reasonable, which is the subject of this debate, a subject that I'd argue only one of us actually addressed. They're only interested in claiming that you can't reason if there is no God. Well, how can they demonstrate the truth of this? I have no idea. But they've removed themselves from the realm of debate when they make unsupported claims, including the claim that they're certain and can't be wrong. This isn't how debates are done. Kindergarten theology coupled with kindergarten philosophy, presuppositionalism is the equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ear and refusing to listen to reason. When your debate practice is to just repeatedly make claims and ask, could you be wrong about that? How do you know that? In order to get people to admit honestly that they're not certain of everything or perhaps anything, you're not engaged in debate. When challenged on clear, repeated appeals to absolute certainty and your response is that you're not really concerned about absolute certainty, the dishonesty is transparent. Saying that you could be wrong doesn't mean that you are wrong and doesn't tell us anything about whether or not you're wrong. The reason that certainty wasn't relevant in this debate, or in fact to knowledge, is that certainty is not a measure of the truth of a claim, it is the measure of the individual's confidence in a claim. Bertrand Russell said the trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. There are big questions in this world. Some of them may forever be beyond our ken, but some of them appear to be discoverable. At this point, I see no reasonable justification for believing that God exists, the subject of this debate. And I also see no reasonable justification for why anyone should ever again waste time debating someone who has no interest in debate, but wants to merely claim that you're wrong because they're convinced that they have a special friend who ensures that they cannot be wrong.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.